Greetings, Culture Warriors. This is Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest Dispatch from the Front. Today's story, this is from Yahoo Finance. Denitsa Sakova. Companies filing for bankruptcy use loophole to give CEOs huge bonuses. The economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic has left many companies no choice but to file for bankruptcy. But before they do, many dole out generous bonuses to CEOs and other executives before they run out of cash. JCPenney, Hertz, Chesapeake Energy are just a few of the companies that recently have given their executives prepaid retention bonuses worth $7.5 million, $16.2 million, and $25 million respectively in the days and weeks leading up to filing for bankruptcy protection, where they plan to reorganize and to eventually emerge with a sustainable business. The practice is common, experts told Yahoo Money, even if the optics can look bad. Companies are getting anxious that they will have to file for bankruptcy, so they're lining their ducks up in a row, John Potto, a bankruptcy law professor at the University of Michigan, told Yahoo Money. And the first duck that most CEOs worry about is their own salary. For instance, in the days before filing Chapter 11 in May, JCPenney handed a total of $7.5 million to some of its executives, including CEO Jill Soltau, who received $4.5 million according to a regulatory finding. Shortly thereafter, the company announced a total of 148 store closures, which likely means layoffs for many store employees. Some critics may point out that all those executives make too much money. They're just stripping the company of money before they declare bankruptcy to feather their own nest, said James Hatch, an executive compensation expert and president of Hatch & Associates Corporation. And sometimes that's true. But in other cases, retaining that executive talent is important for the company's eventual survival despite the price tag, he said. Such bonuses to executives are often considered by companies as a way to keep talent in executive roles while the company goes through its reorganization, JCPenney said decisions it made to secure the future of the company included taking necessary steps to retain our talented management team, it said in a statement. When you have to declare bankruptcy because you have financial problems, you don't want those good executives jumping ship at that point and going somewhere else, Hatch said. While such practices are aimed at retaining those executives or management with years of experience and knowledge of the company, oftentimes the entire executive team and other senior employees also get included in that bonus distribution, Hatch said. If I'm giving it to the CFO, I also have to give it to the head of engineering, the head of sales, the head of various other departments. And maybe what will happen is 2 or 3 people will get swept up in this bonus scheme that don't deserve it. For example, Hertz, which filed for bankruptcy protection in late May, dedicated $16.2 million in cash retention bonuses to 340 employees at the director level and above, including a $700,000 bonus to their CEO, Paul Stone, according to a regulatory filing. That was after the car rental company announced plans to lay off 10,000 employees. Hertz said the payments are an incentive for key employees to remain at the company in recognition of the financial and operational uncertainty the company and its employees face, as well as the substantial additional efforts undertaken by the company's key employees with a reduced workforce in response to an extremely challenging business environment, according to its filings. In the last 15 years, since a major bankruptcy law reform was passed, such pre-bankruptcy bonuses have gained popularity among many large corporations, according to Patel. What these companies are doing is trying to avoid that scrutiny and that restriction on their executive compensation by paying their bonuses out before they go into the court system. They're basically under the radar or outside the radar. Those bonuses are given out before the company files for bankruptcy, so it doesn't have to seek the approval of the bonuses from a bankruptcy court. Bonuses are much more restricted once the company has filed for bankruptcy protection. Okay, and there's more to it, but we get the gist of it from that. So let's now apply our value and culture lens to this story and see what we come up with. First off, there's always a media agenda. You can see that here in Yahoo. They obviously take a dim view of these bonuses. And that's fine, except there's a lot going on in government, not just these bonuses, but double dipping, outright corruption through insider trading and that sort of thing, that never really seems to be of interest to Yahoo Finance. The corruption in the Fed, not really of interest to them. Some of the stuff that goes on with the banks and the Fed, not really of interest to them. So you have to take into consideration that the media often has a view of companies which is very similar to what Hollywood does. Whenever Hollywood needs to reach for a villain, who do they reach for? They reach for a CEO. And so that tends to be the view of most of the people covering these companies in the news ghetto that the business news coverage is typically considered to be within the media culture that prevails. So you have to consider that and read these articles kind of with that bias in mind. And it is kind of pure bias. Now, that said, it is perfectly reasonable to say, well, wait a second. How talented can these executives be if they ran their country into bankruptcy? I wrote a .com down to bankruptcy early in my career, and I can tell you flat out that the executive team wasn't real talented. Moreover, we doubted that they ever intended to make the company a legitimate, ongoing concern. In fact, in that bankruptcy, late in the day, the bankruptcy was held up discussing bonuses of this sort for the CFO and the president of the company. And that didn't trickle down to the head of engineering or the head of anything else. It was just those two. Now, the fact is that through that bankruptcy, they stayed and did whatever work needed to be done. And there was work that had to be done. You got to lay everybody off, right? You got to dispose of the assets. And in our case, that was a clearance. I mean, they just, the company hung around on paper for a couple of years after, but it never, it was really all about working with the competitors to carve up the assets at that point. It's also true that paying these bonuses out before bankruptcy court is a sneaky thing to do. They're not concerned about the creditors here. They're concerned about themselves and, to a limited extent, the people around them. They are certainly not concerned about the fact that many of their creditors and investors are going to be wiped out by the bankruptcy. They just flat don't care. If they did care, then they would preserve as many of those assets as possible for the bankruptcy, because that's how the creditors get compensated. It's a bit much to talk about concern for people when you're basically giving a windfall to your people and sticking it to your creditors. That's, you're not doing anything for them. You're basically robbing the creditors one more time. So it's a little much to see virtue in this. But the practical reality of it is this. If you're going through a bankruptcy which is essentially a restructuring, so the company is intended to be back in business as a going concern, you generally are not going to find people signing up from the outside to come in and do that. It's a lot of hard work. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of emotion. It's a high-risk proposition. Generally speaking, it's considered better to let the people who got you into bankruptcy stay through the bankruptcy and clean up some of the mess. And then turn the lights out in order to get them to stay. And God knows why this is. It's partly because CEOs, only want to hire people who have been CEOs. And if you've been a CEO at a large company, even if you drove that company into the ground, for some reason, people respect that and want you. They treat it like CEO is such a rarefied talent that you gotta dance with whomever brought you, and that the title being conferred magically anoints people with expertise. Nothing could be further from the truth. The fact of the matter is one of the other justifications not used in the article for these big bonuses is that these people's careers at that level are essentially over in public companies, because the stench of failure should really attach to it. But the fact of the matter is that, especially given that some of these bankruptcies are attributable to this pandemic and the absolutely blithering stupidity of the government in shutting down this economy and destroying whole sectors, given that people are going to tend to give them a pass. So that means that they could probably find gainful employment at that level, even in this down economy, elsewhere. And so you got to give them something to stick around. And that's what they've chosen to give them. How they settled on these numbers, it's probably what they could get away with looting from the creditors. And it really depends on who their bankruptcy judge is and how much of a burr under their saddle they tend to have for this kind of gamesmanship. But their tendency is going to be to take everything from the till that they can to ensure that people stick around. Now, you can see what their values are. They're pursuing stability. They're pursuing trying to help the company survive through this bankruptcy period. And they're valuing, they're looking at very much down the lens of the threat of the company not making it. So they put a price on fear here as well. The fact is that for many of these companies, while the layoffs will be significant, the closures will be significant, there will still be a sizable contingent of employees left. And so to some extent, they're valuing those jobs and the employees' continued ability to fulfill them in the new company going forward. But what they're not valuing is something even more fundamental. You know, we all, most of us anyway, are brought up to believe that when you take on a debt, you pay the debt. Whatever it takes, you find a way you pay it. That's just how we're wired. A couple of weeks ago on the podcast, I talked a little bit about Benjamin Franklin and that poor Richard Almanac phrase, neither a borrower nor a lender be, which kind of speaks to this value, as well as to some problems that were had during the early settling of the country, where people treated land tracts as though they were kind of lottery tickets. And they were going into deep debt to obtain more and more land, but that land wasn't profitable, and so it just created more trouble. And so this land speculation that fueled so much of the early economic activity within the colonies and eventually within the American states left a mark on the American character. And it spoke to the need to be frugal, the need to invest well, and the need to be honorable. You know, we didn't have Experian back for most of the history of this country. So you did business based on your reputation. We didn't have zero interest rate credit available to us. The federal government couldn't just print all the money it wanted to when it needed more money. And as a result, money was scarce and investments were relatively rare. And when people made investments, you can darn sure bet they expected to get their investment back plus the agreed upon rate of return. And there was big problems if you didn't fulfill your debt. In the early days of the Republic, you could be essentially placed into slavery. It was called indentured servitude to pay your debt. This is how a lot of people came to this country. Was coming overseas, a very expensive journey, on the assumption that you would spend 7 years paying off that debt through your sweat. Indentured servitude. There have been people killed. Many duels were fought over people reneging on a debt. You could be slapped in prison if you didn't pay a debt. It's true through most of our history. So we take it very seriously that you pay your debts. Obviously, in this case, they no longer value that. The same people who they begged to invest in the business not that long before are the same people that cannot get the time of day from these companies now. So what's going to happen is whatever assets wind up being on the books at the time that are applicable, they will shuffle the deck and these investors will get pennies on the dollar. That happened to me once. Back in the 80s, we had the savings and loan crisis. And what had happened was that as savings and loans were developed as kind of an option to the classic traditional bank, these savings and loans didn't have the same amount of reserves. These credit unions, they didn't have the same amount of reserves that your banks had. They were not FDIC insured, meaning that the federal government, in the wake of the Great Depression and the runs on the banks that preceded it, the Great Depression would not guarantee funds deposited with those credit unions. So what did they do? Well, they started pointing towards the savings and loan equivalent of the FDIC and saying that insurance would back all those deposits. As the S&Ls and credit unions became more and more popular, though, so they offered a higher rate of return on the interest, as they became more popular, those reserve amounts grew higher. They were serviced basically on paper, but not in reality. So the net result of it is when the S&L bubble collapsed and there were runs on those banks, the government didn't back 100% of what was in those deposits. Neither the state nor the federal government would. And so in my case, all the money that had been saved up since I was a baby in those S&L accounts, they locked them one day. I could no longer gain access to them. I was actually in high school at the time. Could no longer access my money. And they, after a long series of hearings and yada, 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 they gave us about 33 cents on the dollar. Just took 2/3 of what we'd saved. Took it. In the wake of that, and they took it and they basically told us, be glad that we didn't lose it all. In the wake of that, there was a flight to safety in the banking system where one of the big banks in the Northeast fleet took over most of those credit union branches. At the time I was at Bank of America and we did the merger with Fleet, in fact, most of the outraged people in the Northeast, upset that Fleet was becoming Bank of America, were upset because Fleet was seen as the savior At the time, they were viewed as a carpetbagger coming in from Boston and taking over all these banks. What happened to all the money? What precipitated this bubble being exposed and everything else? Well, the banks were underinsured, or not the banks, I should say the S&Ls were underinsured. The rich and the connected were given a heads up. And so they pulled their money out and preserved their money. As soon as the rest of us got a wind of it and started to pull our money out to preserve it, they locked it down. So the rich and powerful in the state were allowed to run on the bank and get all of their money back out of it. And the rest of us were screwed. And they had some very well televised hearings on it after the fact. And they brought in these lawyers from Baltimore who were, going to get to the bottom of this and name names and everything else. And, a couple of token prosecutions, but basically they all got away with it. And it was the same thing. They valued their money over everybody else's. They were perfectly willing to engage in political corruption because fairness, equal justice under the law, fairness and justice, these were not their values. And it's the same thing in this situation. Very few of these people that are lurking in the background in this article, very few of them really give a fig about the customers of these companies, the investors and shareholders in these companies. They don't care. Because if they did care, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing. What they're trying to do is partially reinflate this deflated balloon so that they can continue to milk it for money later. Now, the fact is, most of these executives that you're hearing about, the talented management team and everything else, as soon as the bankruptcy's done, they'll be gone. Because nobody, new investors coming in. Can you imagine being an investor, in JCPenney after they come out of bankruptcy? And you see the smiling face of the guy who drove it into bankruptcy? Or gal, I don't know which. Staring back at you, appealing for your funds. Would you give them any money? Heck no, you're not going to give them any money. They already screwed one set of creditors over. Are you kidding me? So they will all have to go. So you have to look at these bonuses a little bit differently. These are bonuses geared towards having people stay around to do some dirty work. And it will be dirty. And it's also to partially offset the fact that they're not going to be with the company going forward. So part of it's, you can consider as kind of a severance package. And looked at in that light, which I think is the most realistic, gives you a fuller appreciation for the values in play here, both on the part of the media, on the part of the company and its executives. Now, in terms of the employees of this company, the non-executives, they won't be getting any bonuses. Not for the foreseeable future. They will have the threat of layoffs hung over their head. Their workloads will greatly increase to try and cover for the missing folks, at least until those assets are disposed of. They have to deal with saying goodbye to colleagues. They have to deal with the fact that the business will be on the decline for the foreseeable future, making them wonder if it'll be there at all. Many of them are tied to the local area, and so they'll have to wonder what they'll do if their site should go down. And yet they won't get anything for their efforts besides the chance to keep working for less than what they were working for before. That's the reality of it. It takes quite some time to come out of one of these things, And so it's unlikely that the more highly tenured among them will see much. If they have pension programs and that sort of thing, those are usually clipped in some way these days. They try to preserve pensions, and give them some priority. Most bankruptcy judges will do that. But they're not looking towards more favorable 401k matches or anything like that. To the extent that they've got stock, they will be screwed just like every other shareholder is screwed. Those stock will be worthless. I will never forget when my .com went under. One of my colleagues went down to Hobby Lobby, bought a corkboard, bulletin board, and hung up all of his stock options, the actual paper copies of the stock option, on that board. And we asked him why he did that. Because, you have to print them. You have to, pay for all that. And he said, because when I go back to my old company, with my tail between my legs, I'm going to hang this up in my work area the next time someone comes to me with an opportunity to become a .com millionaire. There's a wisdom in that, a very deep wisdom, a wisdom won by hard experience and by the scars accrued along the way. And it's one that we should all remember. So when you look at these stories, and unfortunately there are many of them today, it's not quite so black and white as the mainstream media, the left-wing media in this country, likes to present it as these bad CEOs just milking the company. There's certainly some truth to that. But because of the way the system is set up, you need somebody to carry it forward. I would argue that most of these transition situations would be better served in the end by, instead of having the people who got you there primarily involved in the effort, it would be better to bring in a turnaround specialist. Now, employees don't like this, but somebody's got to look out for the creditors, and it can't just be the bankruptcy judge. So this is where your Chainsaw Al Dunlaps of the world kind of made their nut, was in the turnaround. But there should be some bankruptcy leadership specialists whose job is not just to kind of maximize what the creditors get, but to also ensure that a company going through a reorganization is well positioned for success coming out of that. And I would recommend that those people be independently retained and paid by the board, and that the old leadership simply be let go during the transition at an appropriate time when their counsel is no longer needed. I think that will work out better for everybody involved, but what the heck do I know? I'm just the culture guy. And with that happy news, I leave you, my friends. Have a wonderful day.